Hello and welcome to the Lockdown LitFest. It's wonderful to have your company today. Thank you so much for being here. Today we are going transatlantic, more specifically to New Orleans in Louisiana, to talk to Ladee Hubbard about her fabulous debut novel, which is called The Talented Ribkins. I'm delighted to say that today Lockdown Lit is collaborating with the Boxer Diversity Initiative, which is based in Florida. So let me tell you a little bit about that initiative. It was established 10 years ago to improve people's understanding of diverse racial, religious, and gender groups around the world. It's brought global speakers, exhibits, and scholars to Florida. And in one of those strange positives that lockdown has offered, it's very exciting to have the opportunity here at Lockdown to help spread Boxer's work more widely through this partnership today. Do please make time to have a look at their website, which is boxerdiversityinitiative.org. Do that, but don't do it now, because Ladee Hubbard is here with us, and I'm sure you're going to want to give her and her fantastic book your undivided attention. Ladee, welcome to Lockdown. I mentioned those positives that the whole lockdown has brought. I wonder if that's something that you have experienced yourself personally in this strange time.
I'm locked down with my husband and three children. So, as I was saying, it certainly has been an experiment in us spending a lot of time together. So, in some senses, it's nice because I've realized that my children actually enjoy each other's company, and people have not been fighting too much, which is what I was worried about. So that was nice to see, sort of be compelled to see how they do in close quarters over a long period of time. So.
And what about creatively? Have you found that you've been able to write, or have you found yourself creating in different ways?
Definitely creating in different ways. I was working on another novel because I'm always writing, and certainly all the chaos and anxiety and confusion that has been going on in the world has affected that, because it's affected my experience of the world and my perceptions of what's going on around me. So I've actually been writing a lot of nonfiction. I'm not entirely sure why. It's just been very helpful to try and work out my own questions, and to try and I don't know, to try to work through anxiety, and coming to terms with how much the world has shifted in such a short period of time. They're very literal questions, so I've been writing nonfiction as opposed to fiction lately.
And where's that been published?
Well, what I'm working on now has not been published yet. I mean, literally, I'm was working on something this morning. Just they're longer essays that I'm putting together. So, but it's a very personal process for me. It's just something I felt like I needed to do.
I'm talking to lots of writers, or picking things up from what they've been saying online and so on. More people seem to be journaling. They're
Yeah.
writing those very personal things. Have you found that that's something you've been drawn to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what I'm talking about, but it becomes much more analytical as opposed to an exploration of my feelings. So yeah, I've been writing. It probably is, in a sense, journaling, because the subject matter has been really personal, but the way in which I'm writing about it has certainly been affected by what's going on in the world. So that's really what I meant.
Mm. Okay, that's really interesting. Well, we'll look forward to seeing what form that perhaps comes out in the future. Let's talk about the talented Ribkins. Johnny Ribkin. I loved him.
Oh, thank you. I love him too.
That really comes over. Actually, it really comes over that you enjoyed spending time with this character.
Yes, I definitely did. There's the book is a lot of me working through my relationships with my family. So there's a lot of my grandfather in that character. Um, so yeah, I enjoyed spending that much time with the character and appreciating the ways in which he reminded me of my grandfather. So.
So tell us about him. Who is Johnny Ripkins?
Oh, well, okay. He's a member of the Ripkins family, which is an African American family in Florida, and every member of the family is born with a specific talent. And a lot of the book is about their struggle to figure out how to use these talents in a way that will be helpful and contribute to society. And Johnny's particular talent is that he can make perfect maps of any landscape he passes through. So that's who he is. And the plot of the book is he's in when it starts, he's 72 years old and he owes a debt. And so most of the book is a road trip with him and his niece, who is actually 13. And he is driving through Florida, um, digging up bags of money that he has buried in the ground. He did this at various points in his past. So coming to claim the money becomes a way for him to deal with a lot of unfinished business from his past, because it forces him to go back to these places he hasn't been to for a while. And at the same time, it's also his niece Eloise's first encounter with a lot of members of her family that she has not yet met before. And they all have their own talents that they are struggling with, in a sense.
That structure of the road trip allows you, I mean, it's a fantastic sort of narrative drive structure, but it also allows you to smuggle in a lot of the backstory of Johnny and other characters within the novel, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it definitely lent itself to that because he's literally traveling back through his own past, right? Because these are locations that were very significant to him in that past. And because, in part because of his particular talent and his own struggle to find ways to use this talent, a lot of those encounters involve him trying to work through specific sort of cultural dynamics that were going on at the time when he was there. So it became a way, I don't know, only in retrospect does it seem straightforward to me, but to sort of talk about um, certain aspects of African American history, and have it sort of be shaped like a narrative, the story, right? And with a beginning and a middle and an end, like he literally has to go through his past. So it did not seem so straightforward when I was writing it, but in retrospect, I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense what you did. So.
That's interesting, isn't it? I think that's so much the case for so many writers that when you look back, oh yeah, okay, that's how that fitted together. But
Yeah.
yeah, not so much at the time. You hone in on three kind of timelines, if you like. You go back to the civil rights period of the 60s, and then there's what sort of 20, 25 years later, and then the present day. How were you conscious of needing to weave those together, or tell us about some of the choices that you made there?
Well, yeah, and that's part of the sort of the metaphor of traveling through it, is that there is a certain continuity underneath it, like as different as these time periods feel. It's all part of a process, which could be said about today as well. Um, so, and in the book, it's personalized with his own struggle. So the person that he was during the civil rights movement is a very different person than he was in the 80s. And there's a lot of, he's a very cynical person at that point, right? So yeah, so it was a way to sort of talk about larger cultural dynamics in the culture, but as someone's personal experience. That was the point of that, because I do think they're related.
Mm. And he's part of an organisation that's called the Justice Committee
Yes.
back in the 60s, and that's how he starts creating these maps and using them for good. Um,
Yes.
you mentioned metaphor. What are the maps a metaphor for?
They're metaphor for a process, right? Of trying to it, let me see, how could I put this simply? Because I think they mean a lot of things for me, but I do think it's related to what his personal struggle is. That was another thing, is that all of the members of the family have very different talents, is what I call them, and it is a reference to Du Bois's The Talented Tenth. But they're also metaphors for how they're like strategies for dealing with the world. So they all sort of are emblematic of the approach that each of these people take in terms of how to best negotiate the larger social reality. So for him, it's to, like I'm saying, to analyze it and strategize and figure out what is the best way through based on where we are right now. And so, in really, ultimately, I think I use it in different ways in the book, but ultimately, that's his approach to coping, and also to finding a way to survive the world. Some people have in the book have totally different approaches to how to best maneuver their way through sort of the larger American context here in the United States.
Mm.
So,
It's
and going
also
back through time was a way to talk about that historically. So, underlying all the things with talent, of course, as I mentioned, is the metaphor of Du Bois. So, it's specifically, a lot of the book is engaging with ideas of sort of Black leadership over time, over the course of the 20th century.
you mentioned Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois. Tell us about him, his ideas, and yeah, I guess how that relates.
Well, he is a very important figure, who's a sociologist in the United States, and he wrote an essay in 1903 called "The Talented Tenth," which is where the title for the book is referencing that, and it also inspired the way that I'm talking about talents. And the essay, he's making an argument. It really has to do with the larger context for the essay, is that he was making an argument for the need for educational opportunities for African Americans in the South at the time when he was writing it. And one of the things he says is that he identified 10% of the population that needed to be trained to be the leadership class. And this is like a very famous postulation. And the book is not really trying to represent that idea. I think when I wrote it, I was much more interested in varying reactions to that idea, like what saying that meant to different people. So that's part of the idea of a leadership class, is sort of an idea that I think Johnny is working through over the course of the novel. And then I've also said, because it's true, that part of what was interesting about um, just the way it manifests itself in the book is that the Talented Tenth, it sounds very much like a superhero group, and obviously the novel is kind of playing with that as well, in terms of the Justice Committee and the way I thought about um, talent in the book, the way it's represented. It's not an abstract thought. It's a literal thing that people have to grapple with in the book. So that's sort of playing on comic books like the Fantastic Four and things like that.
It's so clever. I mean, they're just, it's layered, isn't it? So many layers. And I kept thinking, oh, yes, oh, yes, oh, yes. And we'll come back to the context of now, if we may, in a moment. But let's hear some. Would you be kind enough to read us an extract, perhaps introduce it where we are in the book? And we'd love to hear it in your own voice.
Sure. So this is the novel. If you can see it there, you can see it. That's the cover. So I was just going to read a very small sample from the third chapter, which is when Johnny he's gone to he has a deceased half brother who could climb any wall. Johnny makes the maps. He had a brother who could scale walls, but his brother died. And when he gets to his brother's house, he realizes that he has a niece that he didn't know he had. And her particular gift is that, well, she describes it as the ability to catch anything that's thrown at her. So these are very real things for them in their lives. But anyway, so I was just going to read a section. He's taking her with him to visit his cousin Simone, who also has a talent. And yes, this is when they first arrive at her house. The chapter is called Vigilance. An hour later, they entered Sarasota. They got off the interstate and took Cattleman's Road to Tamiami Trail, then kept going until they reached the stone pillars that marked the entrance to Cherokee Estates. They wound down quiet, tree-lined streets for 20 minutes before coming to a stop in front of a large, white, colonial-style house. On one side was a swimming pool boxed in a gray screen, and on the other, an enormous flower garden, where an old man in green overalls was crouched in front of a yellow azalea bush, a coil of water hose slung across his forearm as he tended to Johnny's cousin's twittering blooms. "Is this it?" Johnny smiled. He took one look at his niece's face in the rear view and felt nothing but relief to have finally reached Simone's. Somewhere between East Dunbar and Sarasota, he decided Eloise was going to stay with his cousin until he got his errands finished. After he'd reclaimed the money he'd stashed in Simone's yard, he figured it wouldn't take him more than a day or two to dig up the rest of what he needed. While he was doing that, this was what he wanted Eloise to look at. Not just the people who lived here, but the things they'd gathered around them. Respectability, stability, large homes nestled in nice, clean suburbs, proof that all things were possible. So when he told Eloise there were many Ribkins living many different lives, she would know he was telling the truth. "Come meet your cousins," Johnny said, and climbed out of the car. He walked up the short brick path to the front door, Eloise trailing so close behind him that he could feel her shivering against the back of his jacket as he reached forward and pressed the bell. A series of chimes rang out, playing the first notes of a lullaby, a sound gradually replaced by the metronomic swish of slippers sliding across a hard floor. A woman's voice called out, "Coming!" followed by a loud, "Look who it is," shouted through the peephole. Locks were pulled back, the heavy door swung open, and a petite elderly woman appeared before them, dressed in a dark green pantsuit and gold lame slippers. "Johnny Ripkins, is that really you?" His cousin blinked at him with enormous brown eyes. Simone leaned forward, gripped him to her chest, and then reached for his hand. When she took a step backwards and looked him up and down, he could only imagine her thinking some version of what he did looking at her. "Damn, you got old." Aside from that, she looked pretty much as he remembered. Large head, full of thick auburn curls, balanced atop a slim bird-like frame. Skin the sun-glint shade of a new copper penny. Face composed of prominent features, long nose, small mouth, jutting chin, that somehow came together to startling effect. He glanced at Eloise and wondered if he should have explained about his cousin beforehand, given the girl a chance to step outside of the effect and thereby something to marvel at. Simone was possessed of a particularly potent power of illusion and could, at will, make people think they were in the presence of the most beautiful woman they'd ever seen. "Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" "Just passing through," Johnny said. And that so rarely being the case, I just had to stop and say hello. Passing through. Passing through what? Down at my brother's place, Johnny said. You remember my brother. Who? Franklin? Look who I got with me. Johnny reached around, gripped Eloise by the shoulder, and pulled her out in front of him. This is Eloise, Franklin's child. She's spending the summer with me. Simone squinted at the girl and then back at Johnny. After a while, she smiled. What a nice surprise, she said, and welcomed them both inside. They made their way to the living room, a large cavernous space illuminated by the light coming through the windows that looked out on Simone's garden. Potted palms had been placed in each corner of the room, their top branches growing wild and curving against the high ceiling, shading a series of small wood frame portraits mounted on the walls. Nestled inside all the foliage was a beige leather sofa and two matching love seats, arranged in a curve to face an enormous flat screen TV. A teenage boy in a blue polo shirt and khaki pants was sprawled across one of the love seats. At first glance, Johnny mistook her for one of Simone's two sons. That's my grandbaby, Andre. He's staying with me while his father's working in Los Angeles. Dre, turn that mess off and say hello to your uncle. The boy put the TV on mute and, with great effort, swiveled around. Hey, he said. Nice to meet you, Eloise chirped back. You two make yourselves at home, Simone said. Johnny looked around the room. The last time he'd come to visit, it hadn't been like this. Simone and her third husband, the judge, had just moved in, so half their belongings were still in boxes, the yard outside a rolling hill of dirt and sand. He remembered staring out the window while Simone described her plans for a glorious flower garden. He'd been in a bad mood at the time, but at some point felt her hand on his shoulder and realized she was telling him that everything would be okay, explaining some theory of why things could only get better in time. So he'd nodded and tried to smile at her imaginary landscape, when in truth, all he'd seen when he looked out her window was a good place to dig a hole. So I can stop there. I don't know if you're reading.
Let's imagine the whole room, everybody watching is clapping you, Ladee. That's great. I mean, so much came out there, but one of the things is that everybody's always really keen to see Johnny, isn't he? They have great memories of him. But let's talk a little bit about Eloise. You mentioned that Johnny is, I want to say, partly based on your grandfather. How much of Eloise is you?
I'm sure that most of the awkwardness and insecurity is me as a child, in part. And I did spend a lot of time with my grandfather in the back of his car, sort of driving around. So that was a very vivid memory for me. Both Johnny and I mean, I think the relationship, sort of the emotional core of the relationships, and also the way a lot of the characters talk, just speech patterns, and sometimes the way they put ideas together in terms of responding to something someone else says is very much indebted to members of my family or people that I knew when I was younger specifically, but they're also all very, very different. Yeah, Johnny is owes a huge debt to a criminal and all this. My grandfather was a chemistry professor, actually. So they're not none of them are exact. They're not specifically modeled, but they are inspired by sort of things that they make me feel and think about. And I think the same is true of Eloise. It's definitely not literally me, but there are certain elements of her personality that probably are based on how I felt in relation to the person driving the car when I was a child and sitting in the back seat.
Let's talk about those dialogues and the speech patterns, because from the very first page, I could hear them, and I've not stepped foot in Florida or Louisiana or anywhere actually in the American South, but they really were in my head. The accent, the rhythm, and so on. Is that just something that was in you and came out, or did you have to take yourself back to listening to those members of your family when you were younger?
No, I really like writing dialogue, and it's actually very complicated. I find just in general that I don't know. It's weird because I was kind of very influenced by August Wilson and stuff like that. But I find that there's too many words. Like I wind up doing a lot of cutting. So sometimes because it's just interesting to think about how people communicate with each other. Like when you're trying to construct a specific voice. Yeah, which is different than trying to reproduce it on a page. So to me, a lot of the book is. I'm glad that you could hear them because a lot of it is very kind of oral, and just sort of thinking about the sensation of that. But I actually spend a lot of time on dialogue in general because it's very hard for me to um, it's hard for me to feel like the rest of what's going on is working if the dialogue doesn't feel like it's working for me. And language is such a complicated thing. I think the way people communicate, if you're not conscious of it, is very different from how you might imagine you communicate. So that's always been very fascinating to me, and it comes through when I'm working on dialogue. So the very important part of this project was trying to really reconstruct that.
It works beautifully.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
I'm obviously coming to this at this time of the aftermath of George Floyd's death, Black Lives Matter protests in the US, and protests here connected and perhaps sparked by those. You wrote the book in 2017, but I wonder whether this time, this place now, gives it an extra resonance or a different resonance for you.
Um, well, that's really interesting. I actually have another book coming out in January, uh, 2021. That is in a sense a prequel. It's about but it's not a literal prequel, but in a sense it is because it's the main character is there's a patriarch that all of the members of the Ribkins family evoke at one time or another called the Rib King. And so this book is about the experiences of the Rib King at the early part of the 20th century. So I think that I've been more thinking about that. But then when I think about the whole family, I again I do think a lot of the things that are happening now they're definitely um, related to things that have been going on and the reactions to things that have been going on for an extremely long time in this country, and it's just it's such a moment of um, I don't know, anxiety and transformation in terms of consciousness. I find it's very fascinating. So in that sense, yes, but it doesn't change the past. What's happening now doesn't change the past. And being aware, I think, of that larger continuity, that things that people are talking about now, people have actually been talking about for a very, very long time. And a lot of them are things I've been aware of for a very long time. It's interesting how people are reacting to them at this particular moment. But I think that working with this family or thinking about this family, it's a figment of my imagination. But I think it has been like overall a way for me to think about history and heritage and in a certain sense continuity in terms of the struggles of people over time. So
So there is that continuity, and as you say, it's not a new story. Does it feel in New Orleans today that this is different? Does it feel like the 60s, or you've looked back through these periods? Do you
yeah,
feel that transformation, it's pushed?
Well, I wasn't alive actually in the 60s, so I
Sorry,
don't.
sorry.
No, no.
I mean, you look back to it historically.
Right. So, I mean, but just in terms of how it feels very significant. And I certainly think that the protests are enormously important, and also a source of hope and inspiration in this just incredibly fraught times that we're in. It's really very, it's important. It's extremely important, and it's largely unprecedented, in the same way that the pandemic and all of these things going on around it are unprecedented as well. So, yeah, I think it's pretty monumental. Clearly, yeah, I don't. It's hard to know what to make of things that are happening right now in any kind of prescriptive sense, because there is so much kind of in uncertainty. I certainly hope it has a sustained effect and a long-term effect, but it's kind of hard to compare. Was the result of what happened in the 60s, so it's just very hard to feel, you know, like I can predict what will come of it. I certainly hope something does. I can put it that way. I certainly hope something does, and I'm also, sure that it people will need to keep protesting actively, and for that to happen. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it is pretty determined by that, the ability for that to sustain itself.
Mm.
Active resistance as opposed to um, anything else. So.
Mm. And as you say, it's difficult almost to understand it in the moment. But I wonder whether by your prequel, where you're looking at the Rib King, which, I mean, how fantastic that the Ribkins come from the Rib King, because that was his special talent, wasn't it, with the sense of smell and
Yes.
the sauce that he made and so on. So that's obviously going to be a fantastic story. I'm looking forward to reading that. But you have, I mean, that's now an historical novel. You've had to go back to that very difficult time, and actually, within the Talented Ribkins, I can see that it's a harrowing story to have to tell in more detail.
Yeah, and I think that affects the structure of the book that's coming, the Rib King that's coming out in January as well, because it's actually concerned with different things. That's why I say it's a it's a prequel, and Johnny's uncles are actually children in it. He has three uncles in the Talented Ribkin, only one of whom is still alive, and in the Rib King, they're children. Um, yeah, this book is much more concerned with minstrelsy. So it's really about sort of an exploration of the commodification of Black identity and minstrelsy. So it has very, very different themes, and it affects the way it's written. It's a very different book, but it's the same characters and has the same sort of certain points of reference. So it is strange that it was also the idea of going back to like the beginning of the 20th century and talking about it, um, in this way, these issues and minstrelsy and things like that. For me, I can't fully explain how this worked in my mind, but it was very much influenced by Trayvon Martin. So the main character, the Rib King in this novel, the first section, he's very obsessed with trying to save the lives, preserve the lives of Johnny's uncles, these three boys. And then the Talented Ribkins, of course, they're old men, but in this book, there are three boys whose life he's just trying to take care of them. So it's about him being a caregiver to these children. So it was very, again, my point was that it was very connected to things that were happening in the world, in the present, and sort of trying to.
Trayvon is somebody who was shot.
Oh yes, sorry.
Just tell us the story.
So he was a teenager that was he was going to a convenience store, and there were, I guess it was a, I don't know what you would call it. It's just someone thought he was suspicious and had kind of appointed himself as like a security person, and he followed him, and he wound up getting shot. And then yeah, so it was the big news story, and actually the Black Lives Matter as a idea is very much associated with reactions to that incident as well. So so that was a big part of why I wrote this other book. So yeah, I forget. It's so prominent in my mind that I forget that it is possible that people don't recall that, and the fallout from it and all that came out of it, sort of socially and culturally here. So yeah, but my point was that. Hmm? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say it was certainly a news story here, and I think it's something that we're increasingly conscious of as that Black Lives Matter,
Yes.
the movement moves forward, and as you said, the protests continue. Go ahead.
No. That's, I was just talking about, things, there are reasons why, for some reason, that really made me want to go back to the Great Migration and write about that. And it manifests itself also with trying to deal with minstrelsy, which was an enormously popular form of entertainment in the United States during the same period. So sort of the overlap of all these different themes. Yeah, because the Rib King it's the character's name. He creates a meat sauce, and the recipe is stolen from him. So part of the premise of his identity, I guess his public identity, is that the Rib King spends a good portion of his life traveling around the country giving cooking demonstrations as the Rib King. So a lot of because that is part of the plot, a lot of it has to do with commodification and the rise of mass consumerism in the United States, right? And also the commodification of Black identity during that period as well. So very different.
Yeah, no, there are so many different layers to the way that you write, because on the set it's just a rip roaring good read, this book.
Oh.
But then just so many pages I've turned down and bits I've written. God, that's so clever. That's so clever. You obviously have a huge talent for writing, but as we're talking about characters who have very specific talents, perhaps sometimes hidden talents, I wonder if we might finish by asking you, what do you see as your hidden talent?
Oh my goodness. I don't know. I don't know what my hidden talent. I don't know if I have a hidden talent. Yeah,
Or a
I don't
superpower?
know.
What would you like your superpower to
You know
be?
what, the greatest superpower, and I appreciate this about Johnny Ribkins. I was thinking about this too. Like for me, part of the reason why I admire that character so much is because he keeps going and he doesn't give up and he keeps trying, which I don't think in and of itself gets enough credit sometimes. So I hope I have a little bit of that superpower, because I find that really beautiful, and also in his role as a caregiver, the idea that sometimes you survive to survive other people. And that's really I find that really inspiring and poignant, and it's something that I try to or hope to live up to in myself, is just keep going and not give up. And he also, because he keeps imagining different ways to get there. So he's not defeated in that sense either. So that's something I aspire to, and I something I think about a lot. So, but I don't know. I don't know if I have an actual superpower.
I think that's one of them, and certainly it's a wonderful way to end a LitFest conversation, because there will be so many writers who are thinking, yeah, I've actually got to keep going as well. I've got to persevere, and that is it is a superpower, but it's definitely something that you need.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, Ladee, listen, thank you so much for being with us today. It's been absolutely fantastic to talk about this book. The book is The Talented Wibkins. It's wonderful, as I say. And I have to say, let me just read this Toni Morrison quote from the front. For sheer reading pleasure, Lady Hubbard's original and wildly inventive novel is in a class by itself. Toni Morrison says that. I mean, you've got to be pretty happy with that, Ladee. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for being here, everybody. As always, do please keep checking back to the Lockdown LitFest website. There are loads more conversations there for your delectation and delight. And that website again that I mentioned, the boxerdiversityinitiative.org. Do please, you can now go and check that out because we've finished this conversation, so we will allow that. Thank you. And see what they're up to and that collaboration. Thank you very much to them for the partnership with Lockdown today. And see you, Ladee, next time, and see everybody else next time. Thank you.